Welcome to True Drew Podcast, your source for all things Nancy Drew. I'm your host, Avery, and on this podcast, we'll discuss everything from the Nancy Drew books, to computer games, to movie adaptations, and TV shows. Nothing is off the table. So if you're a True Drew, you'll definitely want to tune in for this podcast. Hello, True Drews, and welcome back to the podcast. My name is Avery, and today is our 10th episode. I'm so excited. I've been having so much fun rereading these Nancy Drew books because they take me back to my childhood, a time where I had no bills to pay. I had no problems, really, that I can remember. And I just got to live out all of my adventurous fantasies that were Nancy Drew. Because let's be honest, minus all the boat accidents and criminals chasing after her, Nancy has a pretty cool job. If she got paid, it would make it better, because there's always this joke of like, Nancy has the best job in the world, yet she never gets paid. She never accepts like monetary compensation for what she does. But still, sometimes on at least a semi-daily basis, I'm like, you know what? It'd be cool to be Nancy Drew. Which apparently this thought has been creeping into my dreams as well, because I have to share this with you guys before we get started on today's episode. So I talk in my sleep. It's a known fact. My husband loves to tell me the stupid things that I say when I'm unconscious. And I usually talk about my job or things that are stressing me out in real life, which is interesting because this podcast doesn't stress me out, but I have been eating, breathing, and sleeping Nancy Drew lately with coming up with these episodes, and I guess it was bound to creep into my subconscious at some point. So apparently the other night I woke my husband up because I was talking so much, and I was talking about an attic, and usually I start to wake up after he asks me a few questions, and so he was pressing me, and I was like, I'm looking for the clue in the attic, and I was like, oh my gosh, I was probably talking about the secret in the old attic. I don't know. There's a lot of times where Nancy goes into attics and she finds things that are of importance to her mysteries, but I was like, wow, okay. I am crazy. I have to say, though, I don't know why my husband was complaining because I feel like this was more interesting than some of the things that I talk about in my sleep. Like one time I was working at this restaurant and I needed these cups because we put the banana pudding at the restaurant in these cups. So apparently I was talking about that in my sleep. And he was like, you're asleep. Go back to sleep. And I was like, I'm trying to do my job. I don't know. I can apparently be a hateful sleep talker, but I don't know who I have to thank in my family for passing this unfortunate curse down to me, but this probably won't be the last time. I'll probably be talking about other things that Nancy does in these books in my sleep. So now on to the mystery at hand that we're going to be talking about today, and that is Nancy's Mysterious Letter. This is the 8th book in the Nancy Drew series, and it was written in 1932. And I was able to find a couple of different covers to talk about today. And if you ever want to see these book covers before this episode airs, I always share them on our Instagram, which is True Drew Podcast. And I like to get your all's opinions on which ones you like the most. And if you guys have any funny cover spoofs for these, I also love to hear those. So, of course, the first cover for Nancy's Mysterious Letter is by the magnificent Russell Tandy. And in this cover, we see Nancy at Ned's football game. There's a big crowd, and you can tell they're sitting in some stands. And there's a couple of men in the foreground, and we see Nancy. She's wearing what looks like to me an expensive mink coat. It's definitely fur of some kind. She's wearing this nice little 1930s hat. You can see her gold waved hair kind of peeking out from under that, and she's got heels on. Like, she's real dressed up to go to a football game. But anyway, I think it's supposed to be November when this book is written. It's obviously very cold because in some of the other covers we see snow. Oh, and I just picked up on another detail. So the two men that are in the foreground, the guy on the left is supposed to be Edgar Nixon because he's wearing this yellow camel hair coat. And that's like one of his biggest identifiers within the whole book. So that's interesting. Nice touch. As for the second edition of this cover, we have Nancy and Ira Nixon, who is their mailman, in the foreground. And she is reading a letter. I'm assuming it's the mysterious letter that she gets. But you can see snow and icicles hanging off the house in the background. And so it's obviously colder time of year. and Nancy's got the blonde curled hair. This one, I believe, came out in the 50s, but I have this edition in my collection. I found it at a used bookstore, and I thought it was kind of cool. Now, for the third and last cover, we have Nancy in a pink suit set, and there's just a couple of big superimposed letters behind her. And she's got the strawberry blonde hair flipping out at the ends. It's obviously more 60s. This is the cover that I grew up with as a kid. So I came up with a couple separate spoof covers. And so the second cover it's just too funny to pass up, where Nancy and Ira are standing there and she has a shocked expression on her face. So the cover spoof that I came up with is, "Oh snap, I just won the Publishers Clearinghouse sweepstakes." Now for the third cover, where Nancy's standing there wearing the pink suit and she's got the letters behind her, I just said "The Mystery of Nancy's Secret Admirer," because Nancy is making eyes at the person who's looking at the book. It's just very I don't know. It's kind of an odd cover. It's always been one that stood out to me, but it's not my favorite cover. So these covers are all very different, so I gave them different ratings. I rated the first cover, which is the Russell Tandy cover, 4 magnifying glasses because I think it's just very interesting visually. And the second cover I gave 4 magnifying glasses. Nancy's very shocked and she's scared, and I want to know why. I want to know what she's read in this letter when I'm looking at that cover. And for the third final cover, I just gave it 2 magnifying glasses because it's not my favorite. Now onto the characters we have in this book. We of course have Nancy, Bess, and George. We have Ira Nixon, the mailman, and he has a half-brother named Edgar Nixon, who was the man that we just talked about in the camel hair coat. There is also Tommy, who's a little boy that lives down the street from Nancy. I think he comes up in some other books in the future. There's Mrs. Skeets. She's a woman who tries to punch Nancy in the face. And then there's Nancy Smith Drew, who is the one that has caused all this confusion on there being multiple Nancy Drews. And there's a few minor characters, Marion Wilson and her husband Frank. And then there's Bert and Dave, who are Ned Nickerson's friends. Also, speaking of Nancy getting punched in the face, she's been slapped around the last couple books, like this book and then the book before, The Clue in the Diary. Felix Rabolt's wife smacked Nancy across the face, so not cool. So now I'm going to read a brief synopsis of this book that I came up with. A mystery unfolds when Nancy invites her elderly postman in for cocoa, and while inside, someone steals the mail. The mailman, Ira, had just told her a letter from London had come for her. On a hunch, Nancy quizzes a young boy who is playing outside if he has seen anyone, and when she gets the man's description and relays it to Ira, he faints. Turns out he has a mean half-brother named Edgar who fits the description and whom has been harassing him to share his inheritance. A few days later, Nancy talks to women on Ira's street who talk of a suspicious man who drove off after littering. Turns out that litter is the stolen mail. Nancy notices Edgar watching her house the next day and pursues him, only to narrowly avoid her car collapsing a bridge. It turns out there is a Nancy Smith Drew who has recently inherited an estate. A few nights later, an angry woman named Mrs. Skeets bangs on the Drews' door and demands the $10 her sister-in-law usually sends, which she believes was in the stolen mail. She also lets it slip that she doesn't like Nancy Drews, meaning she's met Nancy Smith Drew. Nancy pays Mrs. Skeets a visit the next day to find out more in exchange for the $10. Nancy also is told by her jeweler, when taking her pearl necklace in to get the clasp fixed, that a man bought her a brooch, but she realizes it was Edgar Nixon, and he must have been talking about the other Nancy Drew. Nancy rips her dress running to the door and finds Tommy, a little boy, who had previously told her the license plate number for Edgar's car. He says his friend found a shoe that fell out of Edgar's car. Nancy gives this evidence to the police and then visits Ira the mailman with more soup from Hannah Gruen. He reassures her that Edgar is not up to anything bad and is in Ridgefield. When Nancy picks up Bess and George, Bess tells her she got a tip from Dave and Ned. The N. Smith Drew putting on a play at their college is Nancy Smith Drew, and she's headed to Ridgefield. Nancy fears Edgar is trying to con Nancy Smith Drew into marrying him so he can get her inheritance. Nancy, Bess, and George go to Ridgefield to the boarding house Edgar was staying at, and Miss Himmer, the owner, gives Nancy some letters that came for Edgar after he left. Nancy gets knocked down by a boy on a sled, and some of the letters are damaged and opened by the snow, so Nancy reads them. They all have $25 in them. Edgar was running a Lonely Hearts Club for women. Nancy next goes to Emerson to watch Ned's football game and keeps thinking she's seen Edgar and Nancy Smith Drew. She and a new friend, Marion, get locked in a room, then Nancy has a rock thrown at her and a car almost runs over her and Ned. Nancy goes back to Nancy Smith Drew's boarding house and finds a coded note of Shakespearean sonnets and follows the lead to the airport, where she is drugged. Bess and George find her, they fly to New York and narrowly apprehend Edgar and stop him from marrying Nancy Smith Drew. So, are you still with me? Because that was a lot. I came up with a newspaper headline synopsis, which is just mail theft and Lonely Hearts scam solved by River Heights teen. So this was pretty crazy in this book. There was a lot of confusion because of Nancy Drew and then this Nancy Smith Drew. So here are some of the notes that I took down for this book. My first note says, Nancy, Bess, and George just came from staying overnight at Redgate Farm, so they must have been visiting Joanne. I thought this random tidbit of information was kind of interesting because usually once Nancy solves a mystery, that's it. We never hear about those people ever again. So I thought it was interesting that they actually went back to somewhere in a previous mystery. So my next note is Nancy says, isn't it unusual to send money through the mail nowadays? Just in the last mystery, Mr. Swenson was doing just that. He was sending mail to his wife. So this must be part of Harriet's rewrite for the 60s and 70s. I mean, it did get stranger and less common to send money in the mail like that, so I guess that's why this is in there. So my next note is a direct quote from Nancy, and it says, do you suppose somebody in England has left me some money? And she's talking about the mysterious letter, and she's wondering why someone's writing to her. And I was like, girl, you don't need any more money. Like, your dad is a distinguished attorney, and you don't even accept payment for, like, the jobs that you do. So why do you care if you have money coming over from England? But I thought that was interesting. So this next thing stuck out to me as kind of odd. Nancy almost goes through a bridge, and all Chief McGinnis can say is, be careful. Like, are they going to put signs up at this bridge so nobody else drives across it? Like, that's all he says. I'm like kind of confused. I'm hoping that nobody in River Heights goes over this bridge because it's going to be dangerous. My next note is a direct quote from Ira, and it says, that housekeeper of yours is a fine, kind woman. She's one of a few a man can confide in. So Ira has a crush on Hannah. Also, Hannah is repeatedly sending this man soup. So if that doesn't say love, I don't know what does. So there's a creepy part in this book where Nancy asks to borrow Ira's picture of his brother Edgar Nixon because she's trying to identify him. And Ira says, so, you like him too, same as the rest of the ladies. Hello, Nancy is 18. There's no telling how old Edgar is, but I was assuming he was in his 40s or something. I was like, that is just gross. Now, here's something that I thought was interesting that Mrs. Skeets says, the woman that tries to punch Nancy in the face. She says, I've seen you go running around town in that car of yours. I don't approve of young girls having cars. There are too many accidents as it is. Like, excuse me? Like, men can't have accidents? I thought it was a weird comment for her to make, but Nancy claps back and she says, did you come here to lecture me about my driving? And then she just says, will you please get to the point? Because Miss Skeets just keeps talking about how young people have no respect for their elders. And it's just like, oh my gosh, woman, get to the point of why you came here. Also, I don't think Nancy has to extend any kind of manners to her. She tried to punch her in the face. My next note is Mrs. Skeets is married to Sailor Joe. His name is just Sailor Joe. And he leaves periodically for the sea. It's funny because he talks in all these ways, like he'll say, oh, my wife hoisted anchor about an hour ago and she'll be back at 6 bells. Like, he sounds like Long John Silver. I don't know. I guess I can see why Mrs. Skeets is in a bad mood because that would get really old really fast. So my next note is Nancy rips her pale blue evening gown and Hannah has to fix it. And they made this a huge cliffhanger at the end of a chapter. It was really weird. Like, normally where they'd be like, Nancy was almost hit by a car. It was like Nancy fell down the stairs and tore her gown. It was a little dramatic. There's also a very funny part of this book where Hannah tells Nancy to get rid of Edgar's shoe after Tommy, the little neighborhood boy, brings it to her. And she says it's bad luck. So I thought it was interesting that Hannah is superstitious. She never really struck me as superstitious till this point. So a big plot point of this story is Edgar is running a Lonely Hearts Club. And Nancy mentions the letters were technically opened when this kid, mows her down with a sled. And she can open them. She's like, oh, it's not illegal because they were already open. And I was like, I'll have to remember that. Harriet won't let Nancy speed in her car, and she will certainly not let her tamper with mail because that is illegal. My next note is about something that Bess said, and she says she'd hate to meet Dave with her mind full of crooks, and George says that's better than nothing. I was like, oh my gosh, George, so mean, but also you just made a crack on Bess that wasn't weight related? Wow, how innovative of you. I did think it was funny though, because Dave, Bess's date, comments on the fur collar on her suit that she's wearing and asks if it's squirrel, and George says, yep, she shot it on the way up here. Also, for this Lonely Hearts Club, the going rate for a husband is apparently $100 is what they determine in the book. And I thought this was funny, but in the 1930s, that would have been $1,800. So quite a bit more, but I was like, that's still cheap on the range of trying to find a husband. My final note is there is a nursery off the powder room at the airport. I thought this was so bizarre. I mean, nowadays you're lucky to get a changing station in a bathroom, but apparently there was a nursery with full-blown cribs and mobiles and just places for you to just take your baby, and that's where Nancy gets put after she's drugged by someone. I was like, oh, okay. Weird. Now onto the part of this show that we like to call What's Cooking with Hannah Gruen. And I also put little asterisks, and I said Hannah also hems a dress for Nancy and repairs the hole in it that Nancy gets when she falls down the stairs. So Hannah is a cook. She's a seamstress. She's just an all-around good gal. She knows how to do quite a few things. And apparently her love language is soup. And she sends Ira soup, which I thought was so nice. But I started laughing just now. I was thinking about it. I was like, it would have been funny if she'd spelled out messages in the vegetable soup, just I love you. I think Hannah is secretly a player. Now, on to some of the things that Hannah cooked in this book. She made some hot cocoa for Ira and everybody when they came in from the cold. And I was like, I love me some hot cocoa. She made this homemade stew for Ira. And then apparently at one point she made steak and a salad of tomatoes and cottage cheese. I don't know, I'm not much of a fan of cottage cheese, but she also made fresh vegetable soup for Ira. So many varieties of soups. I mean, it is soup season right now, so I'm kind of getting ideas. The next thing that I wrote down was she made roast beef and potatoes one night, and then she made chicken and lettuce sandwiches, and then a large bowl of fruit and a chocolate cake. Hannah cooked up a storm in this book. Nancy was around more for this book, her hometown. So obviously she got to take in the perks of that. Now on to the add that to your resume section of this podcast. Nancy can apparently guess the weight of cars with extreme accuracy because when she's trailing Edgar Nixon, she sees him go over the bridge and then she speculates and she's like, oh, but my car is far more expensive and heavy, and I don't think it can make it across this bridge. And she's right. But I'm like, how? How do you know this? Just by looking at a car, you're just like, that's a Chevy. I think it's going to be heavier than this little Roadster or whatever I'm in. Or, it's like, how? I have so many questions. The next thing that Nancy could easily add to her resume is that she's a Shakespearean sonnet expert. She finds this note from Nancy Smith Drew and she's like, oh yeah, I know exactly what that is. That's a Shakespearean sonnet. And not only that, it's from this play or from this book. And I'm just like, how? Okay, I guess you were in the drama department at River Heights High School. I don't know. Nancy is also a phone book directory aficionado. I feel like this is a skill that's lost on many of us because I remember, and I'm going to date myself so much here, I remember the yellow pages. I remember the yellow, the books that people would bring to your house and you just scroll through, and I was always fascinated with how many people are named Smith. And so Nancy goes through all these sections of the directory and just calls people, and it's crazy how much time she spends doing this. But now we have the internet. I just realized I said scroll through because I'm thinking of my phone. Flip through. You would flip through an actual book. Wow, it's so crazy how much technology has just changed even basic things that we use to describe how we're doing something. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and tackle the things that I liked and the things that I didn't like about Nancy's mysterious letter. For the things that I liked, Nancy had to use a lot of deduction skills for this one. She had to rely on more of her profiling skills and more of her just general common sense knowledge so far as, like, she wasn't breaking codes. She was just using common sense. Another thing that I liked was Nancy got to go to Ned's football game. It was a bit long. It was like a chapter long or something. It was a bit much, but I did like that she got to enjoy something that Ned also enjoys. And in a totally unexpected turn of events, I actually liked Miss Skeets, the woman that tried to punch Nancy in the face. And I should probably explain myself. I don't like her because she tried to punch Nancy in the face. I liked her because she was very, very sassy. And at one point she talked about how she wasn't the kind of gal to spend $8 on electric, like her electric bill. And I was like, I feel that. As an adult, I feel that. But also, $8, that's so affordable. As for the things I didn't like about this book, I didn't like Edgar. He sounds like a complete loser, like just trying to beg and bum money off your half-brother, steal his inheritance, and then just, I don't know, just starting that Lonely Hearts Club and manipulating all these women in River Heights and who knows where else. I was just like, I hate this guy. And the fact that he takes it a step further and he's like, I'm going to marry Nancy Smith Drew and steal her inheritance. It's just, ugh. With a name like Edgar, though, I can't say it's unexpected. As for the final thing I didn't like, Mrs. Skeets. I liked her, but then I also didn't like her. I didn't like that she tried to punch Nancy. I was like, okay, you can be sassy all you want, but physical violence is not the answer. And also, she kind of just tended to drone on sometimes. She had some good points, but she just talked for way too long. I was like, no. Now, when it comes to giving this book a magnifying glass rating, I actually gave it a 3 magnifying glass rating, and I know that's on par with some of the other books that we've read. I know there's some people who really didn't like this book. I actually enjoyed it. I know there were parts of it that were a bit of a stretch, but I felt like we got some interesting characters. I mean, Sailor Joe, I keep wanting to say Sailor Moon, but it was an interesting read, and who hasn't had somebody who has the same name as them? And, it could cause major problems, I'm sure. And I thought it was an interesting book. I mean, the whole chapter worth of football plays that we got and Nancy ripping her dress in a super dramatic way aside, I thought it was a pretty good book. So yeah, that concludes today's episode and review on Nancy's Mysterious Letter. For next week's episode, we're going to be talking about the Sign of the Twisted Candles. And I'm excited to read this one again and go over it with you all. So I hope you all enjoyed this episode. And if you feel like it, wherever you're listening, whether it's Apple Podcasts or Spotify or anywhere else, I hope you guys will leave me a review. I'm still kind of getting started and I love to get feedback from you all. Until next time, thank you for listening to this episode of True Drew Podcast. If you'd like to stay up to date on the latest information and new episodes, our Instagram is True Drew Podcast. Or for general inquiries, you can email us at truedrewpodcast@gmail.com.